Today, we have focused in on our youth, and I think that's very appropriate. Mr. DeKoch has made the point that in the church, our children are our most valuable natural resource. And that certainly is true, and something that is important for us all to recognize, the importance that God places on our children, the importance that we should place on them. Mr. Armstrong used to emphasize the extent to which our children are in a special category, not cut off from God. Explains there in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 how that when even one person, one of the parents in a family comes into a knowledge of God's truth and comes to be converted, comes to yield and surrender to God, that there is an accessibility to God that is granted, that is there. Our children are able to grow up with a knowledge of God's truth, to be exposed to that, to be taught that, and to have an understanding in those areas. That's something that is important for us to realize, something that Mr. Armstrong emphasized and Mr. DeKoch has continued to emphasize and to lay great stress upon. Yet, as we look in the world around, that not only is it true, of course, that in the church our children are our most valuable natural resource, that's also true for society. That is true for the nation. That's true for the community. That is a truism. And yet it is something that as we look around, we realize that it is not something that is really properly appreciated in our society as a whole. There was an article back several years ago in U.S. News and World Report entitled, "Children Under Stress." And the article started out with certain statistics showing the extent that children, instead of being treated as a valuable natural resource, are increasingly under stress. Just to quote a few of the statistics, it says 3 out of 5 children born today will live with a single parent by age 18. 2 out of 4 children aged 13 and under live with parents who both work. 1 in 6 children has tried marijuana, and 1 in 3 alcohol prior to the 9th grade. The share of girls under 15 who have had sex has tripled in the last 20 years. The rate for youths under 15 who commit suicide has tripled since 1960. There's a chart down at the bottom showing growing up with one grown-up, the share of Americans under 18 living with a single parent. And they just show the statistics from 1960 to 1985. And in 1960, it was 9% of the young people under age 18 lived with a single parent. By 1985, it had increased to 23%. The article goes on to state that up to 35% of American kids suffer stress-related health problems. And there are various things that talks about the share of children in 2-parent households where the mother and father both work. For those who are 5 years of age or younger, little children, 5 or younger, half live in households, even those that have both parents at home. This is not the single-parent households. These are the ones that have both parents at home. Half of them, who are 5 or younger, both of their parents are working away from home. For those who are preteens, those who are, let's say, elementary school level, on up to age 13, it is 58%. They don't give the statistics for those who are teenagers, but anyway, it just gives a little bit of the whole point of the article is the stress, and the article starts out with a statement of whatever happened to childhood, and talking about the great stress that so many children face and have to deal with. And that is increasingly reflected in our society and the problems that we encounter in our society, the increasingly dysfunctional nature of our entire society. It's no accident that we find just a tremendous upsurge in the various types of problems, the dysfunctional type of problems, everything from alcoholism and to anorexic, bulimic behavior, to all kinds of things, many of which were hardly even talked about a few years ago, that have increasingly come to attention. The article, there's another article in Newsweek just a short time ago, a few weeks ago. It was an article dealing with lifestyle, with the family, and the title of it was Mommy versus Mommy. And it talks about tension between mothers building as they increasingly choose divergent paths, going to work or staying home to care for their children. It talks about the conflict being played out against a backdrop of frustration, insecurity, jealousy, and guilt. It was rather interesting in the wake of the one of the items in the news, perhaps you may have seen it. There was an article, an item in the news in the recent call-up of National Guard troops in the United States. There was a little blurb in the news of one young woman who was called up. She was in the Army Reserves. Her husband was not. So he was left at home to take care of their little 7-week-old baby while Mommy went off to serve in the Army. So, you know, what a tragic, upside-down, insane world in which we live. And the sadness that is brought about increasingly because of our society's lack of recognition and lack of valuing of our children as a most important and precious resource. While many recognize that we're increasingly becoming an ever more dysfunctional society, we see it in so many ways. You know, everything from the increasing illegitimacy and just living together that goes on. Because when you understand the impact that has, you see the family is the basis from which children are produced and introduced to society. Whatever family unit, whether it is a single parent, whether it is both parents, whatever type of situation, whatever is the environment that shapes that child, that is the way in which that child is introduced to his relationships with other people, introduced to society and a community outside himself. So the family is the basis from which children are produced, and it greatly determines their whole level of function, the extent to which they're going to be able to properly function in society. This is why God places so much emphasis in the Scripture on the family, on training and teaching our children. There are commandments that reflect very directly on morality, because the family is that which shapes and molds the next generation. Whatever sort of family it is, it is the basis by which the next generation is shaped and molded. And when you look around our world and you look at some of the tragedies of everything from little babies that are born already addicted to crack cocaine, and some of the terrible things, some of the things many of you probably seen documented on television and news programs and documentaries, regardless of the type of family, good or bad, it is the family that is the basis that shapes the next generation to present them to the world. So the family is the basis of shaping the future generation. Marriage is the basis. The state of marriage is the basis of the family, because the family started with marriage. God created Adam and Eve, and that was, God started out with two parents, with a husband and wife. Marriage has as its basis, marriage is a covenant, it is a commitment between two individuals, it is a covenant between two individuals to be faithful to one another, to work toward a common goal and a common purpose. So marriage is there to provide a basis for a strong, stable, permanent family. Because, and morality is the guardian of marriage. Morality sanctifies and gives sanctity, gives specialness to marriage, morality is there really, in a sense, as the guardian of the sanctity of the family. Because when morality goes down the drain, marriage goes down the drain, family goes down the drain, society goes down the drain. And there is a cause and effect relationship. Societies that have had strong families inevitably have a strong moral basis and strong emphasis on morality that is the basis of what gives the family that specialness and that permanent relationship. Now today I want to focus in on a couple of key concepts that I think are necessary to make the family a launching pad for successful, functional children. Two key concepts that are brought out here in the Scriptures. The first is, the two go hand in hand together. The first is commitment. Now there is a chapter in the Bible that we have frequently called the Christian Living chapter, because it is a chapter that is the basis of the commitment that we are to make as a Christian. It is a chapter that really outlines some very basic things. And I want to just take you through briefly 7 aspects here of commitment that are outlined in this chapter. The realization is that our Christianity does not begin outside the home dealing with other people. Our Christianity is to begin at home. Because our Christianity is really reflected in what we do behind closed doors when the outside world isn't watching. Our Christianity is not a garment that we put on to go out and impress other people with, and we get out in public and we plaster on a certain look and a certain attitude, and we deal a certain way, and we go back and we close the door of our house and we shed it, we hang it up, not to put it on again until next Sabbath, and we go back to being ourselves. You see, that's what the Pharisees did, and that's what Christ indicted them for. Because to them, religion was what you did as an external show to impress other people. And Christ emphasized that religion, godly religion, is what we are. It is our personal relationship with God, which is going to be reflected in our personal dealings with each and every one with whom we have contact. And it's going to begin in the home, because that's where those are the ones we have the most contact with. Romans chapter 12 is frequently been called the Christian Living chapter, and it is a very good place to go to get a point-by-point breakdown of what's involved. Now, maybe you've never thought of it as breaking down in this way, but I want to focus in on 7 specific things that we can just find as we go right through Romans 12, kind of verse by verse. The first point that it makes, the first thing that is the basis of our commitment, is to present ourselves to God totally. To totally turn our lives and our will over to the care of God. To totally surrender to God. That is the basis of making any other commitment really, truly viable. Romans 12:1, it says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. That is the starting point. To turn our life and our will over to God. To surrender to Him. To present ourselves to Him as a living sacrifice. You know, in Psalm 127, in verse 1, a song that we sing here in Sabbath services from time to time, it says, and I'll quote it as it's translated and rendered in our hymnal. I think it really brings it out in a special way. It says, unless the Lord shall build the house, the weary builders toil in vain. Unless the Lord shall build the house. Now that is true in any endeavor. If God is not the center of it, if our commitment to God is not the starting point, if your house, your home, your family, your child rearing doesn't start with a total commitment to God, to yield yourself totally to Him, then it's doomed to failure, because unless the Lord shall build the house, the weary builders toil in vain. That's the starting point for successful marriage, successful child rearing, for successful anything, is that first and foremost there is a total commitment to God. Because if there's not that commitment to God, you're trying to do it on your own. You're trying to make it work. You're going to be a weary builder, all right, and you're going to toil in vain. When all is said and done, you're going to be just worn out, wrung out, ready to pull your hair out, frustrated, exasperated, and your efforts will have you will have just been spinning your wheels. Because the starting point in our lives is total commitment to God, first and foremost. Paul says, I beseech you, I'm begging you, first and foremost, present yourself to God as a total sacrifice. Holy, acceptable to God. We went through recently in sermons and Bible studies some information out of Leviticus and Numbers that particularly out of the book of Leviticus that focus in on the significance of that phrase. And so you can perhaps to grasp that, to be totally committed, to present ourselves wholly to God. Now the next aspect, see the second step, if we present ourselves to God totally, wholly, then the next step is to be transformed in our inner values. Again, the next step even in successful child rearing, because what are we trying to do? What is our objective in successful child rearing? It is to produce adults. See, childhood is not a permanent situation. It is a temporary condition. It is a process that is going to end, and the result is we're going to have an adult. And we want an adult who is functional, an adult who is able to function and to handle things in an appropriate way, and is prepared to take a constructive part in society and to establish a family that will in turn produce yet another generation that will be headed in that direction. The basis of what we then have to do as parents to our children is to transmit values. To transmit values that are right and sound and healthy and wholesome, that are the basis of building a successful and productive life. See, it says, be not conformed, Romans 12:2, be not conformed to this world, but be you transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. You see, the next thing in making our commitment, in really focusing in on what commitment is all about, because if you're going to have a successful family, there's got to be commitment. See, marriage that's the difference between two people being married and two people simply living together. One is an arrangement of convenience that can just be broken up at will. Somebody gets tired of doing something, they just go off down the road. You remember, what was it, the old country song about gentle on my mind, don't want any piece of paper that binds us together. Why, we would just I'll just kind of leave my knapsack there behind the couch and I'll stay around as long as I want to, and when I get ready to leave, I'll just go on down the road. No, commitment. You see, commitment is the basis. That's what marriage is all about. That's what makes marriage different from simply shacking up, to use the vernacular. It is that there is a commitment. There is a commitment of two people to love one another, to be faithful to one another, to enter into a permanent relationship, to establish a family, to work toward a common goal, to work toward a common objective. So it says, now, don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. You see, commitment is the basis of what makes marriage, of what is then to be the basis of establishing stability in the family. And that commitment involves, to begin with, a totality of commitment to God. It involves, secondarily, then, based on that totality of commitment to God, it involves an inner transformation, changing the way we think, changing our values. The very values we are seeking then to transmit to the next generation. it says, be not conformed to this world. We don't want to absorb our values and to simply be a reflection of the society around us. One of the battles you read that has been fought by every one of God's people from the time of the book of Genesis all the way through to the book of Revelation, one consistent battle that all of God's people have fought has been the tendency of the society in which they lived to affect them and to warp their perspective, to shape them, in reality, to distort them from a perfect reflection of the image of God. We're all affected by our society. You go through and you read Paul's admonition to the different churches. You read what John says in the book of Revelation, or we can read the stories of the patriarchs, and we find that all of them were, to some extent or another, a reflection of their society and its values. And it has been the constant battle to battle the influence of society. Now, society changes, and at certain times there's one thing, and certain times there's another thing in terms of its primary emphasis. But God has called all of His people consistently from Genesis to Revelation to come out of the world, not to be conformed to the world around them, but to be transformed by a renewing of our mind to embrace God's values. Society's values can go up and down like a ping pong ball. They can change. They can reflect. You can look around the world at man's varying cultures, and you can find a whole, a plethora of conflicting values. God's values are consistent. They're right down the line. They're unchangeable. They were written in this book thousands of years ago, and they are just as true today as they were when God first revealed them. So we're not to be conformed to this world, but be transformed by a renewing of our mind. Our society today values things. The values of our society are very superficial, very surface-oriented, decadent in many, many ways. You know, there's an interesting source that a lot of people get their values from. I had somebody hand me a clipping. I forget even who gave it to me, but they gave me a little clipping. I've been thought that I would have opportunity to use it, and I thought it kind of fit in. The title of it, we were talking about memory work and learning memory work. Well, see if you recognize this memory work. This is an adaptation of a particular scripture. It's called the 23rd Channel. Now, that may give you a little bit of indication. The 23rd Channel. It is a takeoff, of course, of the 23rd Psalm. The 23rd Channel. The TV is my shepherd. My spiritual growth shall want. It maketh me to sit down and do nothing for His name's sake, because it requireth all my leisure time. It keepeth me from doing my duty as a Christian, because it presenteth so many good shows I must see. It restoreth my knowledge of the things of the world, and keepeth me from the study of God's Word. It leadeth me into the paths of failing to attend church and being useless in the kingdom of God. Yea, though I live to be 100, I shall keep viewing my TV as long as it will work, for it is my closest companion. It presenteth entertainment before me and keepeth me from doing important things with my family. It fills my head with ideas which differ from those in the Word of God. Surely no good thing will come of my life because of so many wasted hours, and I will dwell in my remorse and bitter memories forever. Well, I think we all understand that, certainly television is a tool and is an instrument, and it can be used in a right way. And I'm not condemning television and not condemning the proper use of television. But television is perhaps the single greatest time waster of our 20th century American culture. And I think we need to understand that. It can be something that can be used properly, but it can also be a time waster, and it can certainly be a source of helping us to be conformed to this world and filling our minds with that rather than being transformed by a renewing of our mind. And where are you going to get that new mind? Well, God's Word reflects the mind of God. We want to renew our mind. And that is the basis, you see. You can't transmit. I can't transmit to children what is not in us. You can't give someone what you don't have. So if we're going to transmit right values, stable values, healthy values to our children, we have to renew our mind with a reflection of God's values. Next it goes on to say, in verse 3, and this is the third aspect of what this of what is involved in the totality of commitment. To make that commitment something that is workable and is real, that we're to present, of course, ourselves totally to God. We're to be transformed in our mind. And thirdly, Paul says in Romans 12:3, I say through the grace given unto me to every man among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, according as God has dealt to every man a measure of faith. So, he says, don't have an inflated opinion of the self. Reject an inflated opinion of the self. It makes the difference between the attitude of serving others and a selfish, self-centered attitude. You see, if you think the world revolves around you, then why would you sacrifice for anyone else? And sacrifice and being a servant is the basis of the way that God's government functions. Because husbands, in order to lead as God would have us lead, we have to be a shepherd. We have to be a servant. God's government is based upon the exercise of loving authority. Loving authority. Authority and love are not mutually incompatible, but authority without love is tyranny and despotism. And love without authority is permissiveness and chaos. And neither ditch is the one in which God wishes His people to fall. There needs to be loving authority. Authority exercised in love, in concern, in compassion. And the willingness to serve, to give up, to sacrifice, to do what needs to be done that can be helpful and beneficial. And there's no way that's going to be done when we have an inflated opinion of the self. This is something that is at the basis, you see, of being able to fulfill our commitments. Because if our world revolves around ourselves and all we want to do is what is convenient and pleasant to us at the moment, we're never going to stick with anything very long. It's an important lesson that our children have to learn if they're going to be involved in permanent, stable relationships, if they're going to be able to make the kind of commitment that is necessary to establish a strong, healthy marriage and to provide a good, stable family, they have to learn not to think more highly than they ought to think of themselves, not to have the wrong kind of self-centered, selfish approach and attitude toward themselves. But the only way to convey that, we can't convey that unless we ourselves have it. It is necessary to putting our commitment into action. As we go on down, a fourth aspect is brought out in verse 4. It says, as we have many members in the body, and all members have not the same gift. So we, being many, are one body in Christ, every one members one of another, having then gifts differing. And it goes on through. We have different gifts, different things. Brings out in verses 6, 7, and 8. In other words, a family consists of different individuals. Different members have different gifts. That's true of members of the church, members of a family. We need to respect the individuality of our mates and of our children. Each of them is an individual. They're not going to be just like us. There are different temperaments. Just by nature, and you can look at your own children, you can think back to growing up with your own brothers and sisters, you can realize that from the time you're born, there are certain innate tendencies that we have. Some are just by nature more aggressive. Some by nature are simply more passive. Some by nature are just more social oriented and more oriented toward other people. And interaction with others, and they're very social. Others are much more introspective and given to contemplation and being very perhaps just a lot more introspective. They don't have the same social tendencies, but tend to perhaps be a little quieter, a little more thoughtful, more observant of the little things and details. There's strengths and weaknesses that come with each. We all are different, and that's the whole point. Every member has gifts differing one from another. Somebody doesn't have to be just like you or just like me in order to be okay. We have to respect the individuality of others. And our commitment in our marriage and in our family and in any of our endeavors is not based on the fact that somebody else will become just like us. There has to be a respect for individuality. Now, when there is a unity of values, a unity of basic beliefs, as are mentioned in verses 1 and 2, then you have the basis for mutual respect with compatibility. But we realize that certain things involve the appreciation of the fact that we're different. We have different talents. We have different gifts. To encourage our children to develop their talents and their gifts, not to try to force them all in the same mold. Why can't you be more like your brother? Why can't you be just like your sister? Because I'm not my brother. Because I'm not my sister. Because I'm not that person I'm me. And there's nothing wrong with that. But you see, everybody needs to learn to develop his own talents and to respect those. That is the basis of mutual respect within a family. Respect of a husband for a wife and a wife for a husband. The realization that there are differences, there are individual differences of temperament and talent. And that's great. That's great. God has made it so. But you see, we have to learn a mutual respect for those differences. And that, again, plays a very important part in the commitment that is involved, that is at the basis of strength and stability for the family. Fifthly, there is the emphasis on sincere love. It's brought out in verse 9. Let love be without dissimulation. In other words, without hypocrisy or insincerity. Abhor that which is evil. Cleave to that which is good. Let love be sincere. Let it be wholehearted. The kind of love that is to be at the basis of the family. Real love. God says in 1 John, if we don't love our brother, if we don't love our brother whom we have seen, how can we claim to love God whom we've not seen? That if we really love God, then we're going to seek to build a life based on love. We have to understand that at the basis here, and certainly at the basis of fulfilling and carrying through the commitments in the family of husband and wife to one another, or parents to children, there has to be real love. Real love has to be at the basis. The kind that is outgoing concern, not just selfish incoming lust that is, once that is taken care of, then that's the whole basis of a relationship. Too many times, it's not that the physical aspect of love and of sex is not a part of it, but that's not the totality of it. We live in a society that confuses that does not realize that real love includes much, much more. Let love be without insincerity. Let it be without hypocrisy. Let love be the real thing. Now, the sixth point builds on that and tells us in verse 10 to be kindly affectioned one to another with brotherly love and honor, preferring one another. It goes on and discusses ways in which we do that. In terms of the way we do our business, giving hospitality and serving others in verse 13, of being empathetic to others. In verse 15, seeking to feel for them and what they're going through, to feel with them. Not to be being kindly affectioned with brotherly love has to do not simply with having love, but with the way that we manifest that love. There is a need not only to have real sincere love, but to manifest that kindness and that affection. That needs to start in the family. It needs to be there between a husband and a wife. It needs to be between parents and children. That's a part of what makes the commitment workable and real. There needs to be kindness and affection. but it needs to be based upon sincere love. Otherwise, it can just become a matter of trying to butter somebody up to get our way, and then we go back to the same old carnal, selfish way of treating them. But there's a need to be kind, to be affectionate, to manifest that love, that kindness. We all appreciate a kind word, appreciate proper affection. Then we're told, finally, don't be a vengeful person. Don't be vengeful. Don't try to get even. Don't have a get even mentality. It says in verse 18, as much as is possible, as much as lies within you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves. Rather give place unto wrath. For it's written, vengeance is mine. I will repay, says the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him to drink. In so doing, you shall heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. Don't have a get-even attitude, because there's nothing that is going to tear up and tear down relationships between people so much as trying to retaliate and get back. Thinking, you did something to me, and I'm never going to rest until I get even with you. And that kind of thing even comes out between husbands and wives. Desire to get even, to kind of get in the last word, to get in the last blow. It can come down to problems in the family. So we look at the basis of something that is at the basis of making a family that is stable, that is healthy, that is going to be the launching pad of successful, functional children. And we find that right at the very basis of a family that is going to fulfill its God-ordained purpose, right at the basis of that is a concept of commitment. A concept of commitment, which involves, first and foremost, our commitment to God, our totality of commitment to God, recognizing that if God is not building the house, our efforts are going to be in vain. Seeking to act on that total commitment to God by the effort to yield ourselves, to be transformed, to be renewed in our mind, to replace worldly values with godly values, to reflect that inflated opinion of the self, that self-centered approach to living life, which undermines commitment. Selfishness and commitment take us in opposite directions. To go on to respect the individuality and the differences of others, and to respect that individuality. To make sincere love the basis of our relationship and of our commitment. To reflect that sincere love with kindness and affection in the way that we deal with one another. To not have an attitude of retaliation and get even, but to put those things in God's hands. There we have the basis for total Christian commitment, which needs to begin in the home and is at the basis of producing a stable marriage, a stable home, a stable family. Now, going on and building upon that commitment, I mentioned two keys I wanted to focus upon. Commitment is one. We focused in on details of what that commitment involves, and we've looked at various aspects of what contributes to that commitment. Commitment is the first key, and it is the basis to the second key, which is the key of responsibility. The key of responsibility. Now, what do you mean by being responsible? By responsibility. We need to understand that for which we are responsible and take proper responsibility for it. We are responsible as parents to be active parents rather than passive parents. Active parents rather than passive parents. Now, passive parents have the attitude, that can be the difference between rearing our children and simply letting them grow up like weeds. It's kind of the difference between raising an untended patch in the backyard that just kind of grows up in weeds and just, is all overgrown, as opposed to a garden that is well tended. It's quite a contrast. You go into somebody's backyard and you look And boy, they've got the garden laid out in neat rows, and it's all hoed, and it's well tended, and it's just beautiful. Look at the plants there, look at the healthy plants, and look at the fruit that is being born, and that's nice. Boy, you enjoy that. And that looks real nice. There has been some effort that has gone into that. They have taken an active interest in tending that garden. They've taken an active interest. Now you go in and you see something that's just all overgrown and there's nothing but weeds and briars and who knows what. You don't want to step out in it because no telling what might be there. Probably snakes that live there and all kinds of things. There's no telling. I mean, you can't tell. You just look at it and you see weeds as tall as the eye can see. Now that's what you call a very passive approach to gardening. Just kind of let it grow up and see what happens. Well, when you take that approach to children, you wind up with a bunch of weeds rather than healthy young plants who are bearing fruit. The Bible itself draws that analogy back in the Psalms. In fact, we might just turn there. In Psalm 128. Verse 1, it says, "Blessed is everyone that fears the Eternal, that walks in His ways. You shall eat the labor of your hands. Happy shall you be. It shall be well with you. Your wife shall be as a fruitful vine by the sides of your house. Your children like olive plants round about your table." Now, it didn't say your kids would be like a patch of weeds. It says they'd be like olive plants. Here is a plant. The picture is, of a healthy little olive plant. It's got little olives on it. It's bearing fruit. It's being productive. It's doing what olive plants are supposed to do, and that's bear olives. So it makes a contrast here. If we fear God, if we're walking in His ways, if we're actively pursuing what God has put before us to pursue, we're being active parents as opposed to passive parents. Our children can be likened to little olive plants round about. Healthy little plants there in the garden that are growing up and are maturing and are coming to the point of bearing fruit as opposed to a patch of weeds. To be active parents means simply to be a conduit through which God's government can flow. It means to be a conduit through which God's government can flow. To take an active role. We find that back in Deuteronomy chapter 28, sometimes people make the statement, said, well, you gotta let kids make up their own mind. That's true if you understand what is meant properly by that. I remember years ago in another church area that visited a family. They had been in the church for a number of years. Unfortunately, gotten into problems, and it was very much reflected in the state of their family. Their, in this case, two young daughters, teenage daughters, at home who were not attending church at that time, still fairly young, maybe in their mid-teens, 14, 15. These adults had been in the church since before their children were even born. And the children were not attending church at that time. These two girls, they were participating in various Sabbath-breaking activities in school and caught up in other things. And when I brought the matter up to the father as we sat there, his approach was, well, God gives us a choice, and I give my kids a choice. I said, oh, well, that's good. I'm glad you gave them a choice. I said, you know where God gives us a choice? Back in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapters 27, 28, 29. God gives us a choice. And He says, choose. He says, choose. And not only did God tell us to choose, though, if we're going to tell our children to choose, if we're going to set before them that choice, then we need to understand how God set the choice before His people. Now, God said In Deuteronomy chapters 27, 28, 29, God set before Israel a choice, but that's concluded in Deuteronomy chapter 30. Now notice the choice God set before them. In verse 15 He says, I have set before you this day life and good, death and evil. In that I command you this day to love the Lord your God, to walk in His ways, to keep His commandments and His statutes and His judgments, that you may live and multiply, and the Lord your God shall bless you in the land where you go in to possess it. God shall bless you in the land where you go in to possess it. Verse 19, I call heaven and earth to record against you this day that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life that you and your seed may live. And God set before them a choice, but notice, God made the alternatives plain. I said, when you before your kids, were you setting a choice before them of good and evil, right and wrong, life and death? Or did you set a choice before them of, well, would you rather go to church or would you rather go to the ball game? I said, that's not the way God set the choice before us. And not only did God make clear what the alternatives were, He even told us which one to choose. He said, choose life that you and your seed may live. So God made the alternatives plain and He told us which one to choose. He said a choice, that's right. And ultimately there comes a time of adulthood when that choice has to be exercised. Childhood is the time to educate our children about the choices that they will have to make when they're no longer dependent upon us. You give a child a choice, that's right, but that's what it means to be an active parent. Too many times parents find themselves in the role not of initiating choices, but of simply playing the censor. The child initiates all the choices. And the parents kind of get worn down. The child says, hey, can I do this? Well, no, I don't think you better do that. Well, what about, can I go do that? And, well, no, that's not good either. Well, I can't ever do anything. Well, I don't know. Well, maybe I will let you go ahead and do that, And so finally kind of give in. And the parent is there in the role of the censor. And saying no, 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 until they get worn down. And they finally say, well, I guess, I don't want to just say no to everything. I guess go ahead. But see, that's a backward situation. When we find God rearing His children, God initiated the choices. What we need to do is initiate some choices. Let our children do some choosing, that's right. But we start out with some parameters, some suggestions. Say, well, son, daughter, would you like to do this, or this? You got a choice. What would you like to do? You can do this, or you can do that. You've initiated some choices, all of which fall within the acceptable range, and to give room for the child then to exercise some individuality, some initiative, to make some decisions. Now, you have to do that based on obviously the age of the child. You start out with a little child, and you obviously make more choices completely in their life. You don't go into a 6-week-old baby and say, son, what do you want to wear today? He doesn't care. He just, as long as it's not wet. Now he will complain about that choice, but otherwise he doesn't care what color it is. He doesn't care. He's not concerned about those things. You obviously have to let them make choices on the level of their understanding. But we have to educate them as to which choices are appropriate and why some choices are appropriate and other choices are inappropriate. Active parenting. Active parenting doesn't mean to go, there are two ditches that parents can fall into. You can be so super strict as to be just kind of intimidating and discouraging and overwhelming, and to just kind of browbeat a child down to where they never develop any level of confidence and any ability to make choices and decisions. And that is an extreme, and that is destructive. The other extreme, and I think the one that is far more prevalent in our society today, either ditch is an extreme and either ditch is destructive, But at certain times in society, the pendulum of society has swung more toward one ditch or more toward the other. And while it's certainly destructive to be browbeating and overbearing, that is destructive to a child. As a society, the pendulum has swung away from that extreme toward the other extreme of being so overly permissive that almost anything goes. And that is certainly, just an extremely passive approach that is very, very destructive. That is destructive to our children. God emphasizes in Deuteronomy 6, we're to teach our children. And He says, when you sit down, when you rise up, when you walk in the way. In other words, you take advantage of opportunities day by day to teach and to instruct. To be active parents. To initiate choices. To set alternatives before them that are constructive. To educate them as to why certain choices are unacceptable. So responsibility, being responsible, involves active parents, active parenting, taking an active role, helping our children learn to make appropriate choices, and taking responsibility. It's incredible to me. People want the government to pass laws to enforce a curfew in town. Well, kids, and they're literally parents that go down to the city council. Boy, you need to pass a law to make the kids be in by midnight or whatever the time is. I'll tell you what, that just strikes me as incredible because my dad never felt like he needed the sheriff to make a law to make me come home at a certain time. He didn't need somebody else to tell me that I had to come home. He told me, when I was to be where, and I didn't go anywhere without asking him to begin with. And it was he made it very plain early on. And he never felt like, I don't know, everybody's doing it. I don't know if I need somebody to make my kids do so and so. Well, that's ridiculous. Why should I as a parent have to rely on the city council to set a rule as to what time my child has to be home? As long as they live with me, I'll set the rules as to when they come home. Real simple. Real simple. And but you see, there are people who wanted the church to in that role. In fact, it's bothered some, and they have really wanted the church to be kind of the boogeyman. I have literally heard parents tell their children a certain issue would come up, maybe some extreme of clothing style or something that was just way out or immodest or something just inappropriate, and they would tell their child, the child wants to do this because everybody else is doing it. With some crazy haircut or some too short or see-through, slit-up skirt or whatever it may be. And they say, well, I don't know, boy, you better not do that, boy. The minister, he might, I bet you'll get in trouble there at church. I don't think the minister will like that. Hey, what's wrong with that? Well, it's like, hey, I'd like to be a good guy, no problem, but you know how that church is. Well, I guess, you probably better not because you and I'll probably both get in trouble. Well, it's like, the church is the bad guy. This mean old church going out there and ridiculous. If something is right, then it's right, and we ought to educate our children to understand why it's right and why the other's wrong. And we ought to have the sense of responsibility to take responsibility for the rules we set. Instead of trying to blame it on the school or blame it on the church or blame it on the city council. Well, kid, I guess you'll have to be home at midnight tonight because they passed a law and they said everybody's got to be, got a curfew here in town. That's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. It's because people don't want to take responsibility. They don't want to be responsible. Nobody wants to say the buck stops here. I guess the older we get, the more that we can appreciate and look back and value things that we learned growing up. But I think that's there are many lessons that I greatly value that my father taught me. But I think that is a concept that I greatly appreciate and I have valued more and more as the years have gone by, because that was something that he very much he was willing to take responsibility, and I appreciate that. And I think that we as parents, we want to teach our children to take responsibility, but if we're going to teach them to take responsibility, we've got to be prepared to take responsibility for what we're responsible for. And we have to understand, of course, the limits of that responsibility. We're not responsible for what all kind of things that happen that are totally out of our sphere of control, but there are things we're responsible for. We want to be active parents rather than passive parents. Not going to one extreme or the other, but initiating choices, being a conduit through which God's government can flow. Part of that, being an active parent, involves understanding how a child learns. God draws an analogy in the Scripture that involves the development of the digestive system. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul says, "And I, brethren, could not speak unto you as unto spiritual, but unto carnal, even as unto babes in Christ. I fed you with milk, not with meat, because you weren't able to bear it." And he goes on talking about this. In Hebrews chapter 5, in verse 12, Paul says, When for the time you ought to be teachers, you have need that one should teach you again that which be the first principles of the oracles of God, and are become such as have need of milk and not of strong meat. Everyone that uses milk is unskillful in the word of righteousness, he's a babe. Strong meat belongs to them who are of full age, even those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. Now, draws the analogy, a little child grows and his digestive system matures. You don't you take a newborn baby and set a big beefsteak down before him and say, "Dig in, kid. We're going to celebrate. You're just born. We're going to have a celebration. Here's a steak." He doesn't want that. Couldn't digest it. He wants milk, because that's all his little digestive system can handle. In fact, it's amazing the way that God has designed even just that aspect. That a mother's milk for the first few days is totally different than her milk a little later. Because the needs of the baby's digestive system are totally different. And as they change, there is a change that takes place. But the first milk that comes out is totally different from the milk that is given a little later. Right? And it has to do, there are various factors that come in there. But, God drew this analogy here because as a child grows, as they develop, their digestive system matures, and they gradually are able to handle other foods. But again, you don't start out with meat. You build up, and finally there comes a point where they can digest all kinds of things. And in the same way, our children learn and they develop mentally, emotionally, spiritually, gradually, from milk to meat. And it says in verse 14 of Hebrews 5, strong meat belongs to those who are totally mature, who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. They have learned to make decisions, to make appropriate decisions. They have had opportunities to use and exercise judgment, to develop proper judgment. They've been given opportunities. What you do is you set parameters and you allow the child to exercise initiative within those parameters. You've got to set parameters. Otherwise, maybe they want to play with matches and they set the house on fire. Is that an acceptable option? Well, I hope not. We set parameters. We want you to play. You can choose your toy, but you can't choose your parameters are not everything. You can't choose, you don't sit down and tell little child, pick whatever you want. So he picks a sharp knife and a box of matches, and he goes to sitting there playing with it. No, you limit his choices to those choices that are appropriate for his age. And then you give him choice within that range. certain things you don't allow them maybe to play with at church. It's not, they say, well, you can bring anything you want to church. So he brings the drum set, sits there and plays the drums during church. That's not an appropriate choice. If you want him to play it at home when you're in the living room, that's fine. That's up to you. You can exercise that option. Chances are you don't. But, there's nothing wrong with doing some of those things, but it's a matter of what is appropriate and when it's appropriate. So you set parameters, and you allow them to exercise choices within those parameters. And as they grow, as they educate and become educated in their minds and their lives, through the ability to make decisions, you gradually widen out those parameters, and it's a gradual thing so that by the time they're grown and they leave home, they're able to handle things. They have had experience making decisions. They need to gain experience making decisions, but it has to be within acceptable parameters. Responsibility, involves being an active parent. And it involves being responsible, our responsibility to our marriage, to our children, and even to our parents. We might just turn in Colossians 3:19, it says, "Husbands, love your wives, and be not bitter against them." See, we're responsible to love and to care for our mate. It says in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 33, "Nevertheless, let every one of you in particular so love his wife even as himself, and the wife see that she reverence her husband." So many problems between husbands and wives go back to the fact that a husband did not truly love his wife and make her really feel very special and very loved, and a wife did not really respect her husband and didn't make him feel that she really respected him and appreciated him in a very special way. So many problems go back that a wife feels unloved, a husband feels disrespected, and there is resentment. Being responsible means to apply this. It means being responsible in our families, with our mates. Being responsible with our children means, as it says in chapter 6 of verse 4 of Ephesians, "Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord." Now this word nurture is the word that's translated tadia in the Greek. It means literally discipline. It's the word that's translated chastening throughout Hebrews 12. It's translated instruction in 2 Timothy 3:16. It's translated nurture right here. Bring your children up in the discipline and in the admonition of the Lord. Help them to instill. We go from external discipline to self-discipline. Don't be overbearing with them, but on the other hand, don't go to the other extreme and just kind of let them grow up like weeds, but bring them up in the nurture and the discipline and the admonition of the Lord. To teach them, to help them to make a part of themselves, to internalize, to understand not only what to do, but to understand and to be educated as to why, so that it becomes internalized as a part of it. We're responsible in terms of the way we treat our mate, in terms of the way we treat our children. We're also responsible even as adults for the way we treat our parents. It says in chapter 6 of Ephesians, chapter 6 verse 2, "Honor your father and your mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long upon the earth." The other scriptures, even back in Proverbs, talks about not forsaking, our parents when they're old. There is that responsibility we have to show honor. This is the basis of continuity in the family. It's an example to our own children, and that continuity of connection from one generation to the other that gives us our sense of identity, of who we are. Commitment and responsibility lie at the basis of successful families that are launching pads for successful, committed children. Commitment is the basis of being properly responsible, and the two keys go hand in hand together if we're going to provide a positive, healthy launching pad for our children to prepare them for taking a constructive part in the world and preparing and dealing with the next generation.